In this lesson, we'll face and counterbore the mounting boss. After completing this lesson, you'll be able to create a facing toolpath, export 2D adaptive clearing as a facing toolpath, and use the ramp option on a 2D contour. Let's carry on with the file from our previous example, and let's begin following our process plan in creating our toolpaths. The next toolpath on our process plan is going to be facing the mounting boss. So this boss right here, the geometry needs to be cut down to this face, and then we need to do a chamfer and a counterbore and other things like that. So to get started, we'll take a look at the tools we're using, Tool 10 and Tool 8. Tool 8 is going to be our 1/4 inch end mill, and I'm going to use the 2D adaptive clearing option. I'm going to keep Tool 8, and for my geometry or pocket selection, I'm actually going to select the bottom edge of this chain. I'm going to make sure that I flip sides so that I'm only focusing inside. I'm also going to go to heights, and I'm going to change the bottom height from selected contour to selection and use this top face. So this will ensure that I'm cutting that entire diameter of the bore, but I'm going all the way down to the top face rather than the bottom of the part. In the passes section, notice that I have some options that I can turn on and off: minimum cutting radius, a slot clearing option. We can also turn on or off stock to leave, which I'll turn off for this case, and we can use multiple depths. I'm going to leave all these as default with the exception of stock to leave and say OK. So now we can see that the tool is doing a helical ramp in and cutting that geometry. Let's select everything and go to simulate and see what this toolpath looks like. We're going to show the stock but turn on our toolpath, and I'm going to navigate all the way to the end. And notice that when I do that, it's leaving this thin shell or this small area here. So this is telling me that this really doesn't work as a toolpath because it needs to extend past that. So if we take a look at the adaptive toolpath and see if we have any options in here that we can turn on or off, we can take a look at stock contours, which will use the entire outside, but for the selection, we really don't want to use that entire part, but we don't have anything that we can focus on without going into our sketches and showing a specific sketch. But we have some options for turning on rest machining. We can use a wrap toolpath, which will go around a cylinder, but again, in this case, it doesn't really help us, and tool orientation doesn't help us either. When we go to passes, we don't have a step over amount. We're looking at multiple depths, but this doesn't help us in terms of stepping outside of that geometry. So when we take a look at this, we don't really have a way to bring the tool in from the outside. We can use leads and transitions, but again, this is going to keep it inside that geometry. So in order to actually cut outside of this area or bring the tool in from outside, we need to look at a different toolpath, a different option. When we're talking about 2D options for adaptive clearing and for pocketing, it's going to contain the tool either inside or outside of our selection. If we use an option like face, we can use the facing option. We can select this edge here, which is going to be our chain selection. We can manipulate the bottom height based on a selection. We can come down to this edge or this face. And then when we take a look at passes, we can do multiple depths because we're not dealing with an adaptive toolpath. We can step down a specific amount each time, and we can have a finishing step down if we wish at a much smaller amount. Let's just see what this toolpath looks like. So now you can see it's going back and forth, and it's just cutting that geometry for us. So we can take this adaptive toolpath and we can delete it, and then let's select Setup 1, and let's see what this facing toolpath will do. I'm going to jump all the way to the end, and notice that the facing toolpath is able to clear everything. I'm going to go to a previous operation, and I'm going to play through this facing toolpath and just see what it looks like. So you can see it's starting a bit higher than it really needs to, so we can adjust some of our initial heights. That way we're not wasting a couple of these first passes without actually cutting geometry. And it looks like we've gone 5 or 6 passes before we actually get into cutting anything. So this at least tells me that this is a valid option for us in order to clear out that geometry. So under passes, we're going to change some of our options. We have a step over amount, which is based on the tool diameter, and that's perfectly fine. We can turn on chip thinning, which will allow us to change the way that it enters and exits the stock. And then for our maximum step down value, right now it's 0.03, but we're going to increase this to be 0.125, which is half of our tool. We're going to have that single finishing step still, and the finishing step down is going to be 0.025. And we also want to take a look at the extension. So if we want to add anything to the start or the end of this toolpath, we can turn those on in leads and extensions. And we can also take a look back at the geometry we selected to make sure that we're cutting all of that. So now we've adjusted the way that the tool enters and exits the stock, and we're still cutting everything here, so everything looks pretty good in terms of facing that geometry. While we still have this tool, we're going to go in and create the counterbore. So I'm going to do this a couple different ways. We can do it with a 2D pocket, we can come in and use the 2D contour operation, or we can use some of our circular options like bore or circular. For this instance, I'm going to use 2D contour. I'm going to select this inside edge, making sure that the red arrow is on the inside. We're not going to add any extension to it. We're not worried about rest machining. We're going to tell it the height for the top of stock is going to be based on the selection. And we're going to tell it that the feed height is going to be based on the top height. And then in our passes, we're not going to worry about multiple step downs. We can allow it to go down and just cut everything at the final depth. We don't have to leave any stock, but we do want to make sure that we're entering and exiting the geometry properly. So we're going to leave the default settings on, and we're going to take a look at how it enters and exits this geometry. And it looks pretty good. It's entering and it's cutting that geometry and it's exiting, but this is going to be a plunge, and if we haven't pre-drilled, it's going to potentially cause a problem. So let's select everything, again go to simulate, we'll jump all the way to the end, then we'll go back one operation, and we'll play through how the tool actually comes into the geometry. Now if this 1/4 inch end mill happens to be a center cutting tool, it's going to be perfectly fine. We can reduce the feed rate and we can plunge into that geometry. However, if it's not a center cutting tool, we're going to want to turn on the ramp option and allow it to ramp down along that contour. So let's go ahead and say OK, and now the toolpath is going to be ramping down into the geometry. If we select setup 1, go back to simulate, again we'll jump to the end, then we'll go back a single toolpath and we'll play through this. So notice now it's doing that helical entry. It's starting a little bit above, but it's moving its way down and it's cutting this geometry. Now this is likely clearance for some sort of head of a bolt, so it's not going to be critical. It wasn't called out on the drawing, so we don't necessarily need to do multiple steps and have a roughing step in and then a finishing pass. It's going to be good enough for this geometry based on what we're seeing here to just come in and cut that with that ramp down contour to get down to the final diameter. So at this point, let's go back to a home view and let's assess what we've done so far. Based on the process plan, all the previous toolpaths were already created all the way to this 2D contour. Then we have a facing operation to take down the top of this mounting boss. From there, we went in and we did a counterbore inside of that area. So this still leaves a few things that need to be cut. We have these small pockets that need to be cut with this same tool. Then we have the big chamfer and the small chamfers, and then drilling and tapping that hole. But for right now, let's make sure that we save this file before moving on to the next step.